Hello and welcome back to Ride Rescue. In this episode of the Pontiac, I think it's time to start addressing some of these, or I should say the major rust issue. The car doesn't have a whole lot of rust. It had rust in the front fenders. If you've watched all my videos, you'll see I did repair those. It has a little rust hole on this rear fender. It has a little bit of a rust hole on the other rear fender. A couple other little minor spots. The biggest area is this rocker panel. It is just all tissue paper. It's kind of interesting. The other side only has one teeny little hole and it's all solid. This is the rocker panel off of the parts car. And it's solid. There's no rust in it at all. So I cut this panel off to use for this piece. So I'll go ahead and just take the skin off of this. There's an inner panel in here that is also rotted. The inner panel is good in this as well. So I'll have to take this apart in layers and then take this one apart in layers and layer it all back together. You can get aftermarket panels. I've seen them done on other cars. I've seen them done online. They just aren't the same. I'm really fortunate to have had this panel from the parts car because this contour just doesn't match the original with the aftermarket pieces. It also has this contour and lip. Even though this is covered up, it just doesn't have the same look. And I want to have this car someday be a concourse contender. It's a great car. It has good bones. The floor pans, the frame, everything is so solid. So it only makes sense that I want to do this the best possible, and the aftermarket pieces just aren't all that good. If I'm careful and I seam it in the right spot, somewhere around in here where it's flat, and then bring it across, I'll be able to grind all those welds down and nobody will know it's ever been done. And it's factory original stamped metal. We'll start by getting this panel out of the way. I'm very fortunate on this one. It looks like I have good solid metal all along this channel. Start right here. I'm going to go just with the width of the tape away from this seam. That way I'll be able to do the same thing on both pieces. Well, my plan is dashed. As I'm getting over here, I find it's very weak. So I'm going to have to come all the way down here. This area is weak too. So I'm going to have to get closer and closer to that body seam. There, like I say, there is lead in there, but I'm just going to have to deal with it. I wanted to stop about here, and I just had to keep going and going until I found good solid metal. This whole area was just tissue paper, but there's an overlap seam right about here, and fortunately that seam is all solid, and it's solid as far back as I can reach. I'm getting there. Looking pretty disastrous at this point, but it has to get worse before it can get better. Now that the outer skin is removed, you can see inside of this, this lower area here is actually the outer skin. And then you can see there's an inner skin here that goes down the middle, and then there's another fairly thick sheet of metal that goes onto the floor braces. You can see this line here. I believe that's a gas line, so I'm going to have to be cautious of that. This bottom seam is spot welded together, so I'm going to have to drill out those spot welds. I need to open up this seam and drill out the spot welds. There's some along this center of this panel too. But in order to find all these spot welds in the surface rust, I'm going to use a wire wheel. Where they're starting to expose. It's kind of hard to tell, but there's little indentations, and then these areas showed up much clearer. I purchased these spot weld drill bits many years ago. They're about $7 a piece. They're kind of expensive. They don't last very long. I get just as good a results by drilling an 1/8 inch pilot hole and then using a larger drill bit. But they work pretty good. We'll see how long this one lasts. This top seam, my air compressor just doesn't keep up with the cutting wheel, so I'm going to use a little saw, and I'm going to split it down the middle. On the car, I rode right out on the edge, but on this piece I'm going to go more towards the middle, and then I'll have some room to play with. Okay, I used my little saw to cut that whole seam. And then I cut this end off. Hopefully I've got enough there. If all the rivets, spot welds are drilled, it'll go apart. Just like that. So this piece is much cleaner, much less rust than I had hoped for. So this is awesome. This is too far gone to save, but it'll be an excellent pattern to make a new piece for the car. Now that I have this piece somewhat prepared, I can measure it up to the car, and as you can see, I have plenty of overlap now. If I would have cut it right at the end, I would have come up about 1/4 inch short on this end like I thought. So now by just shifting it down 1/4 inch, I have enough room here where I can overlap it. And then I can cut it, and it'll have a precise cut. Do the same thing here where it's overlapped. I can cut that and it'll have a precise butt weld, and then I can do the same thing down here. And the nice thing about having this factory original stamping is it has details in it that you can't get on the aftermarket pieces. There's a dimple here that's an alignment dimple for lining up the panel. There's a drain plug here, and there's some little details, stampings along the edge too that was probably for some kind of alignment on the factory assembly line. So those would be lost if I would just use an aftermarket piece. And for a car like this, that's perfectly fine. But if this car was ever to be taken to a show car, these are a must. The judges will notice those details, especially when the other side has that same detail. So what I've done is I've butted this end up. You can see where there's about the thickness of a grinding wheel, and then it overlaps right along here and down along the bottom. As you can see, as it overlaps down underneath here, then I will be able to cut right along that edge, and it'll give me the perfect gap for a seam to weld to, for a nice perfect butt weld. And then the same thing on this end. You see I have considerable overlap here where I've cut it, so I'll be able to split it somewhere along this area, and the same thing with here, split it along this area with the grinding wheel, cut both through both thicknesses at the same time, and then it'll be a perfect fit with a nice butt gap. And then I can grind off all those edges, clean them all up, and be ready to weld in. And then once I get this up in alignment where it should be further back, that will tighten up this gap along here. And then I can just run my grinding wheel right along that edge, and the top edge will be ready to weld in. And then the bottom edge, you can see where that clamp is. I'll need to clean that edge up, and that's where it's all the spot welds will be. I've got the outer skin pretty much roughed in. There's definitely some areas that I need to adjust a little bit, but inner skin wise, there's two of them. I was going to make this piece, but I don't have the tools to make one with a bend that long for that little bottom flange that is missing. So I actually bought one online. It should be here next week. So I'm going to wait and cut in a fresh piece of metal on that. It's an aftermarket piece, but it's just a channel, so it's pretty simple. I'll go ahead and trim the top of this off. It's got some good solid metal along the top, so then I won't have to drill out all the spot welds across the top. This area I'll have to make a plate for. It's just a flat piece. That'll be pretty simple. And then I can patch it in around that area. For now, I want to trim most of this off and get things ready for that panel when it shows up. You can see now I'm starting to get into some good solid metal. There's actually some primer on that inner panel. As you get into this area, you can see right through it all. It's a fairly decent gauge of metal. It's just a flat piece, so I'll be able to kind of trim up around it in this area. There's several different layers going on, but I still have to trim around in there. And then I'll weld in that flat piece, and then I'll weld in the channel, and then I can put on the outer skin. I've been trimming and grinding. I use a wire wheel to really clean this area up, get all the rust out of the pits, get rid of all the loose rust. I wiped it all down with some chemicals. I just used some old solvent that I had, wiped it off really good. Then I used a rust converter, converts it to a black primer, and then I also covered the whole area with a black paint. I like to do it this way rather than using a weld-through primer. You can see I paint the whole area, and then I put a piece of tape and I marked where all my spot welds are, and then I just grind off with my grinder where that's going to weld to. With the weld-through primer, you get that area so hot you burn off the primer anyways, so by using a black paint in between them, then I've got a good bond and seal in between the spot welds as well. And then I'll do the same thing with the other two sheets as I put it all back together. I've got the inner panel primed and painted on the inside, and then once I get this welded in place, I'll prime and paint the outside of this piece that goes in. You can see where I've ground off the edges and prepped it. Once this paint dries a little bit more, I'll start getting all these panels together and start welding. You can see I've got this inner panel now in place. I've just got a couple of magnets that are holding everything all lined up, and it is ready to start tacking it in a few places, and then I'll weld it in. Normally I would keep moving around, especially if I'm working on the outside of a sheet, but this is all hidden. Nobody will ever see this. If it was on the inside, it'd cause some warps and it would be noticeable. But since this is going to be sandwiched in here, I'm not too concerned with any warping. I'll move around a little bit so I don't get it too hot in any one place, but just kind of move across. Do a little bit of stitching. Okay, now that I've got that all burned in, I will do a quick coat of paint on it, and then I'll start putting the outer panel on. In this area, there's some lead, and especially under here, I'm going to heat up that area and get as much of that lead out as I can. Now that I've heated this up, you can see it's a fairly thick amount there. There's a recess for that weld area and lead, and that you can see nice little puddle of lead that dripped on the ground. I'm lining everything up as much as I can, just some vice grips. Once I get this area lined up, these points, then I'll tack these corners, and then I'll be able to better align these tops. You can see this is a little bit high. This gap's a little too tight, so I'll grind open that once I get this tacked into place. You see, with that tacked into place, now I can move down to this end and get those lined up, and I'll do the same. Once I have these two areas tacked in, then I'll tack across that edge, and then I'll move down to spot welds to go on that bottom edge. And I can burn this thing in. In order to line this up perfectly, I had to jack that up just a hair, get everything lined up. I still have a little bit of adjustment to do, but once I get in a couple of tacks, then I can start moving this around a little bit. That area is pretty tight. I'll have to get out my grinder and open that up just a little. I burned this area in, and you can see as I come across the top, I tacked it in, and then it starts to overlap. This panel is a little bit high, this one's a little low and underneath, so I'm opening it up a little bit, and then once that's opened up, this one will drop down, and then I can get it lined up, and I'll just have to kind of move along as I go until I have it all tacked in place. Then I can come back and burn that in. But by having that slight gap on a butt weld, it's perfect, because then I can fill up that gap with weld, and then I got a good solid panel. Now you can see I'm finally getting some progress. I've got some tacks. I've got it evenly spaced. I've had to pry up and down to get them exactly where I wanted them. Just to be positive that this hasn't warped or gone anywhere on me, I like to use a long straight edge and verify that nothing is getting off. Make sure that this fits up against the door. Since I have this edge as a guide, I was very comfortable with it anyways, but now we got the straight edge on there. I can see it's perfectly straight. I'll burn it in. Just going along tapping on this area, it looked like there was some little holes, and sure enough, you can see what turned out to be fairly large holes from just little pinholes. By going along and tapping with a screwdriver on any little pinholes that I might see, I found a couple of them. There's another one right there at the edge of the rear fender too. I'll use this piece as a pattern. Just trace it and cut it out. Looks good. I'll cut the other one to this other hole and we'll tack it in. Now that I've got it all welded in, I ground it down smooth. I found I had a little bit of a high spot here and a little bit of low spot here and a little bit of high spot here and a low spot here. So I worked this down. You can see with this straight edge on there, I've got it where I've got a little bit of filler here, which I knew I would need, and I've got a little bit of filler right here, just minor, and then we're just a little bit of a low spot there too, but we've got to fill over all the weld anyway. So I'm really happy with this. And we got this little one finished too. Now that I've got everything welded, ground down, first thing I want to do is wipe all the surface down with solvent. With that all cleaned up, this is the filler that I prefer. There's a few others that I like to use, but this one performs really well. It has longer working life, as well as it sands quickly. It sets up fast and you can start sanding and it doesn't gum up your sandpaper. I have a waxed paper that I use and just tear it off and throw it away. Well, that'll be it for the first coat. I'm sure I'll need another, maybe a thin coat in this area, and for sure in this area. But, once that cures up, I'll just skim over another coat, and then should be ready to start sanding here real soon. I like to run a real heavy grit. This is about, I think this is a 36 grit sandpaper, and then I've got some 80 grit sandpaper. I'll use the 36 to just really rough it in, knock off the high spots, and then I'll go to the 80 grit to smoothen things out and take out the real deep scratch. You have to be careful with the heavier grit too, because it'll go right through your masking tape. Well, it's still somewhat not fully cured. You will plug up your sandpaper, but this particular filler just comes out with a wire brush. The lower cost fillers just sticks in there, it won't come out. And then once I get it smoothed out where I want it, then to round these edges off, just take a small piece of sandpaper and then go through and clean up all these little detail edges. Not bad for the first coat. I sanded it down until just starting to see a little bit of transparency in a few spots. It's so minor. I mean, it's just a thin skiff coat already. I don't feel bad at all to put another coat over these low spots. You can see there's just a little bit of a low spot right there. But this from the factory, these are typically pretty wavy. There's a body seam right here in this area. I wanted to keep a hint of that body seam, so I hand sanded it and kind of contoured it to show the way the factory may have left it. But when it comes to the painted surface, I want to make this as flat as possible. Now that I have all of the filler down along the bottom, the rust issues all taken care of, the rocker panels all taken care of, I was just going to paint this strip, but as I get working up, there's a lot of dings in this area right here, door dings. It had some pretty deep surface rust, so I've ground that out. And then this rear quarter panel, my plan was to just do that little patch, but there's a long crease that I need to straighten out. There's several dents, dings, and then there's this old repair that I want to grind out. There's some surface rust that's creeping under the edges of it, and there was a pretty big patch of surface rust here too. So I'm going to just paint from that trim piece down. I pulled the trim out, so I'll get a much better, smoother look, and then kind of rough it and scuff it and make it look like the rest of the car. So thank you for watching this episode of Ride Rescue. If you like what I'm doing, please leave a comment, like, share, subscribe if you haven't. Really appreciate you tuning in. Goodbye for now.